If you want to avoid completely botching your next interview like this...
What's Joe Rogan's dream?
What's Joe Rogan's dream?
Joe Rogan, Dana White.
Then you want to listen to everything that I'm about to say. I have been a professional host/interviewer for over 10 years now, and this is how you want to interview your next guest properly. The first thing you're going to do is tell your guests what they should expect, and that can mean two things. It can mean sending them easy to follow instructions on how to use the podcast interview software, link to how it works below just in case you're new to it, or maybe it means sending them every single question ahead of time so that they know what to expect and they can come up with a compelling and fun answer to entertain your listeners. Which is not as psycho as it may seem at first. Do you really think the most famous celebrities and athletes can just be wildly entertaining, on command, mid-interview, on a talk show, with the whole world watching? Of course not. So why should it be any different for your guests? Chances are they're not going to be a celebrity or an athlete, right? It is your duty to entertain your listeners and to inform them. And if that takes a little bit of behind-the-scenes trickery to save those listeners from boredom, then maybe you should consider taking that option. Because unless you're talking with someone who's media trained, there's a good chance that they can come off nervous and stiff, thus creating a lot of dead air and cringeworthy responses.
How was the party? I wasn't invited.
Actually, no, that's not the truth, Ellen. You were invited.
Trust me, I have been there before, and it is like pulling teeth trying to get more out of that guest. But telling your guests what they should expect doesn't have to be like you're reading the rules from a dangerous illegal water slide, because then you're just going to scare them off. There needs to be an open dialogue on what you both want from the interview. Let them suggest some questions, or even just let them steer the conversation in general, especially if they're an expert on that subject. And if that helps them feel confident, then they'll shine more and provide better insight to the subject, thus keeping your fans happy and making you look a lot better at your job. It's a win-win if you ask me. This is all really to say, regardless of the way that you end up doing your interview, you should be in full agreement with your guests so that they can feel as comfortable as possible. But before we take a look at some templates for planning questions and general structure, we should talk quickly about research. More specifically though, what you should be researching. Now there is very little point in interviewing someone that you already know everything about. It's going to be boring for you, and it's going to be boring for them, and it's definitely going to be boring for your listener. You don't need to study the Wikipedia page of your guest or their chosen subject for that matter. What you need to be able to do is think about a question like someone in their field would, which means sharing that same curiosity for that subject matter. If you're interviewing someone who is an expert in, let's say, kangaroo psychology, you don't need to know anything about kangaroos, but what you need to do is at least have watched some kangaroo videos. This way you can ask yourself, why on God's green earth are these creatures so evil, and why does he hate Australians to share a country with them? Authentic curiosity creates authentic questions, and that desire to actually know more about that subject will take your interview a lot farther than if you were to just ask ChatGPT to generate some questions. So you got curious, and now you have some questions. But how do you structure them to keep it entertaining for your audience and make your guests feel comfortable? Well, a good podcast interview is split into 4 sections. The first is the introduction, where you welcome your guests to the show, and then spend maybe a minute or two talking about all of their accolades and how great they are. This will make the guest perk up or lock in and reaffirms in the guest's mind that they are important and they have something of value to share. And after you're done with introductions, you then move on to section 2, which is the main body of the interview. Start with light, general questions that introduce the audience to the subject and provide context before slowly asking more detailed and thought-provoking ones. Section 3 is when you really focus on what your guest's key insights are and ask the big questions that you really want answered.
Were Ross and Rachel on a break?
Absolutely.
And finally, section 4 is the conclusion, when you give the guests an opportunity to share some final thoughts. You can find a link to a template with all of this in the description down below, as it is a great way to separate out your questions into the best situation possible. So you've got questions, and now you've got the structure for your interview, but how do you step past and create your own signature interview style? And I'll explain what that means in a minute, but first we need to talk non-negotiables, the things that every interviewer needs to do regardless of who you are and who you're talking to. For one, every interviewer should keep questions short and simple. And that may seem strange. If you got a big brainy mind on your show, then why not ask them big brainy questions? Well, because your job as a podcaster is to not make yourself look like the genius. Your job is to get interesting yet easily digestible answers from an interesting person. When your guests look good, you look good. And no one understands that better than Joe Rogan, who has spent over a decade having the most fascinating conversations with some of the world's most notable scientists, scholars, and skull crushers. Joe understands that asking a simple question and then actually giving the guest as long as they need to answer it is the key to having a successful podcast and conversation in general. Our next video is on lessons for creators from Joe Rogan. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. And while we're on the topic of non-negotiables that every interviewer needs, take a look at Drew Barrymore. The former child star is fantastic at the vital interview skill known as empathy. Barrymore is consistently empathizing with her guests and is an extremely active listener. By doing little things like nodding to show that she's engaged or repeating their words back to create a feeling of comfort in the guest as if they're finally being heard, it guarantees you authentic answers in a warm environment. And what's not to love about that? And this isn't a new technique. Before the age of podcasts and YouTube shows, people like Oprah Winfrey were using empathy and dynamic body language to ask super tough questions in a supportive and non-judgmental way, even with a huge live studio audience watching. So you need both simplicity and empathy. But how do you add your own signature flair to your show and make people want to watch your interview with the president rather than Theo Von's? Well, if you're new to podcasting, then I would recommend developing your own signature question. A question that relates to the core idea of your podcast and the one that you can always ask your guests. And to find your signature question, you need to ask yourself which part of 5 W's interests you the most when talking to a person. Who, what, where, when, why, and sometimes how. An example of this could be, who made you the person that you are today? Or when was the stream born? I can't give you your own signature question because only you know what sparks your interest the most. But here's mine. Why haven't you subscribed to the channel yet? Once you find your rhythm interviewing people, you may not need a signature question, as your natural curiosity will take over when asking the perfect follow-up question using the 5 W's. And finally, we need to talk about what you need to film your interview. Essentially, all you're gonna need is a PC or cell phone and a couple mics. From there, if you're using Podcastle, then you'll be able to invite up to 10 guests to your podcast with a simple shareable link. And because your audio is recorded on separate audio and video tracks, you don't have to worry about your Wi-Fi derailing the whole thing. And you can also edit everyone's track individually with one-click AI features. Then Podcastle hosts and publishes to all platforms, and you can use Podcastle free forever. That is special. But what's more special is 50% off that you're gonna get from your first month using Podcastle using the link in the description down below. I'll see you in the next one.